In this unit, we will spend some time considering how we budget for research projects and what potential funding opportunities there are to support research work. So we will cover specifically budget categories and what budget categories look like typically for research projects, and then we'll spend some time talking about different funding sources and the differences between funding sources that are available for research activities. So this is really just a general list of typical budget categories that we see as part of research budgets. And so if you've done budgeting for work or other types of activities, you'll see that these categories really are not substantially different. Typically, as it is with any type of program or activity, your personnel costs are often one of the first things considered. So this might be the personnel for the researcher, for clinicians involved, for research assistants, for staff, depending on the size of the project and depending on the project budget. This really can be a very substantial category, or it actually might be a small category if it is a smaller project or a project that does not have tremendous financial resources. As it is often the case, a research project typically does not support the full-time salary of a researcher or of a clinician. So oftentimes one of the best things to do is to determine how much time the researcher or clinician, if that's the same person or if those are different people, actually will spend devoted to the research project. Determine some sort of hourly rate and then figure that personnel cost from there. Because it's really only in very large projects, typically very large federally funded projects, that substantial salary costs will go to the research personnel. The second category that takes a lot of consideration, a lot of development, is that of equipment. Equipment is typically specified as non-disposable equipment. Sometimes there's a dollar amount, so it might be materials that are over $300 or over $500, for instance. But typically, it's easier to think of it, I believe, as equipment that will still exist after the project finishes. So this might be particular equipment that you need. Let's say you're doing a study on a particular type of splint. It might be the splinting pans or the heat guns or the particular equipment that you would need to conduct that study. Sometimes equipment includes computers. Sometimes that goes in the technology category that we'll talk about here in just a moment. But think of equipment as your non-disposable materials, the materials or the equipment that will be remaining after the conclusion of the study. The next category is that of supplies. So unlike equipment, these tend to be disposable materials. So these are the materials that you will use throughout the course of the study and typically use up. And so by the end of the study, these supplies are used up and they're no longer there. So in the example of our splinting study, then the supplies might be the actual splinting materials. You will use them to construct the splints on the person. You'll use up those supplies, so by the time you finish your study, there are no more splinting materials left. This can also include things like record forms for assessments, is another example of supplies. So it's any sort of material that you use to conduct that study, but they typically are smaller cost items and more specifically items that will be disposed of. Printing is a budget category that you'll want to consider or think about. So it depends on how you are collecting data, if you're mailing out information, if you're mailing out recruiting letters, if you have a mail out survey, all different reasons you might need printing for a particular research project. So you want to try and as closely as you can account for that, as well as postage, of course. Technology obviously can be a very large budget category. So as we said, it may include computer costs, it may not. Sometimes that might be determined by the funding source as to where you place some information, or that just may be a decision you make as the developer of the research proposal. One of the growing areas of technology costs we're certainly starting to see are things like server space, maintaining licensing for software. So it may not actually be hardware costs, but it might be other types of technology fees and services that you need in order to conduct that survey or to house that data or to house that information. Travel is an important budget category to consider. So this may be travel that's needed either for the researcher, for data collection, if you're collecting data at different sites, or any other travel that might be associated in order to conduct that particular study. You'll want to consider any recruitment costs you may have. So this may be cost of recruiting participants in the study. If you're going to offer some sort of incentive, you'd want to include that in the recruitment cost. So again, it could be how different costs associated for getting people to participate in the study, or if you're going to offer any sort of cash payment compensation for their time, or any other sort of monetary value item that you might be giving would go into this category. You also want to think about any consultants you might be using as part of your study. So things like statisticians, which is nearly always a consultant you will utilize with your studies. Most researchers, by the time they go on for other advanced research courses, are able to do basic statistics, but I believe very strongly it's always important to have at least a statistician look at your study plan, look at your data analysis, and ensure the accuracy, because for most researchers that's not their true area of expertise, although they do have some skills. It could also include consultants such as experts. So perhaps you are proposing a study on a particular intervention in a classroom. Well, it would be wise probably to include a review by a teacher, or the type of person or the type of professional who might be implementing that intervention in the classroom, to have them review the protocol and ensure that it's a realistic plan for the study. So any other type of content expert that you might need as a consultant on your study, you would need to consider as part of your budget as well. Sometimes this might be an hourly fee, or sometimes it might be a per diem fee, depending on the level of expertise or the notability of that particular consultant. These fees may be smaller, or they actually may be quite large, but it could be very important to the success of your study. Another budget category I wanted to talk about is what's called indirect costs. And these are costs that are essentially institutional costs that then are charged against a grant, but it doesn't really apply to a specific item that you're spending funds toward. Oftentimes this is set at a particular percentage off of a project budget. So it might be 5%, it might be 10%. Sometimes a grant or a funding source will stipulate a maximum amount of indirect costs that can be attributed to a project. Sometimes it can be as high as 25 or 30%. And the rationale for these costs are these are the things that help support the university achieve its research mission. So this includes things like covering the IRB, the Office of Sponsored Programs, who manage the accounting and manage the financial aspects of research, and other just operational expenses for an institution that then provides the support for a researcher to do his or her work. So for instance, if you have let's say a $100,000 project, and your indirect costs are 10%, then $10,000 of that project budget might go to this category of indirect costs, which are essentially institutional costs. Now, for the purpose of your project, we won't consider indirect costs, but I just wanted you to be familiar with that budget category. And as you're reading through different grant proposals, you may see mentioned indirect costs allowable or not allowable. So I wanted you to be familiar with that term. So budgets are typically considered or presented in some sort of table, essentially a spreadsheet. So you'll see your expense categories there in the left-hand column, so the things we already talked about. You may have some things that apply differently, so don't feel that these are the only categories you can have, but these are just typically the most common categories that end up being utilized. Then the center column is probably really the most important part, and that's either the explanation or the justification of those costs. And we'll take a look at an example in just a moment, because you don't want to go just from the expense category to the cost. You don't want to say, well, my personnel costs are going to be $1,500 and my equipment costs are going to be $1,000. You have to explain in your proposal and to essentially potential funders how you're deriving the cost for your project. So you need to go through and be able to explain what is the cost per unit of that item, what is the particular item, what is the quantity of the item, and then how do you arrive at that cost. So just as a very quick example, it may look something like this. So let's say you're hiring an OT to give a very specific intervention. So you'll have the personnel justification as one occupational therapist. You're going to spend 4 hours in training with that OT. You've agreed on a rate of $50 per hour as a per diem rate. So training will cost $200 for the occupational therapy cost. And then the OT will be responsible for 5 hours of intervention for 10 subjects at $50 an hour, which will be a total cost of $2,500. Similarly, you're going to hire 2 research assistants who will be paid $15 an hour for an expected 80 hours of project work. This includes data collection and data entry. So for the 2 assistants, that will be a cost of $2,400. Your equipment costs we can see here are broken down. So you're going to purchase 3 iPads for $499 for your project for a total of $1,497. Similarly, iPad covers, and you're going to purchase 2 TVs at $280 each for a total of $560. So it's important that you have the budget item in the category, but it's extremely important that you're able to justify those expenses so a potential funder can see when you've come up with a project that totals $5,000 or $10,000 or $250,000, where have you derived those costs and how is that money actually going to be spent? So you need to make sure that you think through each of the items that you're putting in the categories, because what you don't want to just say is, well, personnel is, I think, is going to cost about $2,000 and equipment is going to cost about $3,000. These have to be very specific numbers. You want to estimate as accurately as possible. You don't want to intentionally overestimate because you need to be accurate in the amount of budgeting that you're doing, but you also want to be realistic. So, where does money come from that it supports research activities? And it can come from several different sources, and we'll talk about each one of these. You probably are most familiar with hearing about grants, and there's 2 different types of grants. There's public grants and there's private grants, and we'll talk about the distinction. And then we'll also talk about contracts. Contracts are a different example of funding where maybe a particular agency or organization specifies what type of research work they want carried out. People would apply to do that work and do that essentially under a particular contract, and that functions a little differently than grants. So let's next talk about specific grants. So first we'll consider grants of public funding sources. So these are the grants that you typically hear about at large institutions like ours that come from national sources. So national meaning federal or governmental sources that are intended to have a budget in which they distribute research dollars. So this includes institutions that you're certainly familiar of, like the National Institutes of Health. The National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research is one that also funds research, be it occupational therapy research or research that we'd be interested in or related to us. The Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services, or OSERS. So these are typically large-scale projects, meaning we're often talking into high hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars of budget for the project. They tend to be multi-year projects, so these might be projects that go over 3, 4, or 5 years for that amount of funding. These sources tend to favor certain types of research or things that follow their particular priorities. So let's say their focus is on a particular type of research, maybe Parkinson's disease or something of that nature, and you're doing research in another area, then you probably won't be considered for funding because it doesn't meet their research priorities or their research agendas. These typically go to people who are experienced researchers, so you have to have a demonstrated track record of research. So if you have an idea for a study, it's really, really unlikely that you can apply for an NIH grant and would be funded initially because, and that's understandable. And we as the public probably want that because these are significant research dollars that are going to researchers. So you want to ensure that it's someone that has the experience and the resource and the support to be able to effectively carry out that study and have a conclusion for that study. As you can well imagine, these types of grants are very highly competitive, and not surprisingly, the dollars for these continue to shrink, so they become even more competitive. So if it is something that a researcher is qualified to do and can apply and is awarded it, then that's a really tremendous support for their research. But the reality is, many researchers are not going to be qualified for these types of grants, or they may try and not be successfully funded, which doesn't necessarily mean they don't have an important topic of study. It just may mean that it's not meeting the agenda, or due to the highly competitive nature of these funds. The reality is, many researchers who would be capable of carrying out the research, and we could even say are deserving of that research funding, actually go unfunded. So the other option is private funding sources. So these typically come from private grants or private foundations. They also tend to fund a specific area of interest. Sometimes they might be very regional or local in nature. So this might be grants or foundations that were set up by influential or affluent families or people in a certain community, and they would fund particular things related to that community or particular areas of interest. Other examples might be things like the Diabetes Association, a particular organization that's focused on a specific condition, but has a foundation that supports research activities to which researchers can apply. And obviously, then their research would have to be related to the initiatives of that particular association or organization. Another line of private funding source comes from industry. And so this might be from manufacturers of different types of equipment or materials, or pharmaceutical companies. And the reality is, much of the pharmaceutical research that goes on in the country today is actually supported by the pharmaceutical industry. And obviously, concerns have been expressed over this. Then, do researchers feel undue influence or undue pressure to find certain results if they are researching a particular product or a particular drug for that company who is then supporting their research? But you certainly hope all ethical considerations have been taken into account. And the converse issue here is that without private funding or without industry funding, then many of this research work would not take place because there's just not enough public funding sources available. So it just becomes something that we have to be aware of. It is integrated into the research process, and again, we see it in certain types of research over others. But just know that industry funding is considered a private funding source. So here's an example of a private foundation in the San Antonio area, the Kronkosky Foundation. And this was set up by a family as a charitable foundation or a charitable organization. And we can really get some information about the types of things that they fund by looking at their website. So you can see over to the left, their focus is on health and human services and culture. And you can see just by reading through their information that their focus is to improve the quality of life for elderly and those with disabilities by helping them be healthy, productive members of their communities, to free children from abuse and neglect. And here we have an idea about the geographic regions in which they support different research activities, as it says to improve the health of persons living in Bandera, Bexar, Comal, and Kendall counties in Texas. So one of the things about private funds is they tend to be very focused. So if you are a researcher and you live in, let's say, the Dallas area, then there would be no purpose in applying to any sort of grants that are issued by the Kronkosky Foundation, because they only fund research that would benefit people living in the stated communities. So it becomes really important that you understand the requirements for private foundation grants. Because if you don't meet their areas of interest, if you don't meet their requirements or their parameters, then you'll never get funded by them. Grants coming from private foundations can range in size. Sometimes they provide nice startup funds. They certainly can support pilot projects. So it's not uncommon to see grants for $5,000 and $10,000, which to many researchers really can be a significant boost in getting started in an area of research. Others do award larger grants, so they might get into the tens of thousands of dollars, but it's typically rare that you see private foundations offering the size of grants that are offered by the public entities such as the National Institutes of Health or NIDER. So there is a difference typically in the size of funding available from private foundations to public grants. So the process is that most granting organizations either put out information as a request for proposal or an RFP, or they will announce the grant. And this happens in different forms depending on the agency. So what they require you to submit will largely look like the research proposal that you were preparing for your assignment. You need to have a background, you need to have the objectives of the study, the research questions, the purpose of the study, what are the study procedures, who will benefit from the study. So much of what you're writing for your research proposal assignment is typically the types of things that are asked for when you're applying for funding for a grant. So you need to be specific with regard to the criteria. Some grants are only funded if it is a collaborative grant, so you would want to ensure that you're working with other types of researchers or other consultants. Other grants aren't that specific. So the key thing here is you just really have to know what the criteria for the grant is, follow that criteria, or ideally be a strong fit for that criteria in order to increase your likelihood of being funded. Because this is an organization that will be providing the financial support for a research project, the budget is an extremely important part of the proposal process. Most funding agencies will have specifications regarding what are allowable and non-allowable budget items, if there are any caps in any budget categories, or how they want the budget presented. So again, it becomes very important on the part of the researcher who's preparing the proposal for funding that they follow all of these items. So no matter how tedious that may seem, oftentimes then the research agency, the funding agency, if you submit something that doesn't meet their criteria or isn't specified to what they allow or disallow, then they will no longer continue to look at your proposal and you won't have any chance of being funded. It's important to know the deadlines for different types of grants. Some follow a very specific deadline. There are certain times of the year they are due. It might be once a year, it might be twice a year. Others might have an open application process. We typically see that in the smaller types of grants. So they might have a certain amount that they fund across the year, and they will continue to fund projects until that money is spent. So again, being aware of the requirements of the funding agency, what they're asking for, following that criteria, and meeting the deadlines will certainly increase the chance that you will be at least considered for funding by that particular organization, because if you don't meet those requirements, you know you're not going to be considered. So how is it that we find potential funding sources? One, it helps obviously to spend time looking at sources that are a fit for your particular area of interest. So sometimes that comes through information from your professional associations, from your institution. You need to understand to whom sources will grant the money. Most researchers need some sort of an affiliation, be it with a university or some research group or some sort of nonprofit organization. So in other words, it's probably essentially impossible for an individual person who maybe is interested in clinical research, who is out maybe practicing in a hospital, to apply for a grant completely on their own without any sort of affiliation, because you also need the support of things like we've talked about previously, like an institutional review board. So you have to be in the context that you have that support and those resources. So that's oftentimes why a funding agency will only grant funding to someone who has that sort of affiliation. It doesn't mean you actually work there. It means that you can work out a cooperative appointment or a cooperative affiliation and have that institution's support for your particular research endeavor. It's important that when you apply for funding that you follow the application procedures exactly as specified. Again, if you don't meet that criteria, most of the time your proposal or your application is discarded and won't be considered any further. It's very important to recognize the competitive nature of funding, and it's very easy to look at the grants that are out there and think that, oh, it must be really easy to achieve funding because there's so many funding sources out there and you can just apply for a grant. But the reality is most grants have tremendous competition for them. You need to be able to demonstrate a track record oftentimes in that area, or at least show that you have carried certain research projects from beginning to end or to completion. Collaboration is also important, and being able to express why is this particular research important, and then how might it lead to further study. Because if an agency, if a foundation, if a granting organization is supplying money, then they want to ensure that that money is being well spent with you, that you are a good choice in terms of a person who's capable of carrying the project out, and that the project is going to lead to useful information and ideally additional study. So there are all different sources out there in order to help you identify potential funders. There are websites that you can search. Some you search by specific criteria. Some you go and you look at the funding sources that they have available. So these are just a few websites or URLs that I've provided. Also, our Health Science Center Office of Sponsored Programs, that's really the source for grant information here at the Health Science Center. So they will run different listservs, different email blasts that they will send out information about grants that are available, or you can fill out information based on what your particular areas of interest are, and then they will send you information on grants that help support that particular area. So searching for funding has certainly become much easier. Because you can have search engines and listservs that help you identify things. But the reality is then that only gets you so far, and you need to spend time then looking at the individual grant, what the requirements are, what types of research are they funding in the past, and then most specifically, really understanding what is it that they're looking for so that your proposal meets all of those requirements. So as part of your proposal project, what